Berlin, January 30th, 1943, 11 o'clock in the morning. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, is standing in front of a microphone. In a few moments, his voice will be carried live across the entire Reich. This is the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, and Göring's speech is the centerpiece of the celebration. Every radio in Germany is switched on. The speech never starts on time. Because at that exact moment, at rooftop height over the German capital, in broad daylight, 3 British bombers are streaking across the city at nearly 400 miles per hour. The air raid sirens begin to howl. The broadcast cuts out. And the most powerful Air Force officer in Europe, the man who once promised that no enemy aircraft would ever appear over Berlin, is hustled away from his own microphone while the bombs come down. The speech is delayed by more than an hour. That afternoon, Joseph Goebbels is scheduled to speak at 4 o'clock. The British know that too. A second wave of bombers arrives over Berlin at 4 o'clock, precisely. Here is the part that made it unbearable. The aircraft that did this, that flew to the capital of the Reich in daylight, in front of the entire German nation, and made its 2 most powerful men look like fools, was not some armored giant bristling with gun turrets. It carried no defensive guns at all. It had a crew of 2, and it was built in large part out of wood, plywood, balsa, glue, assembled by furniture makers, cabinet shops, and piano companies. When German intelligence first learned that Britain was building an unarmed wooden bomber, the assessment wrote itself. This was desperation. A country running out of aluminium, running out of options, reaching back to the last war for materials. Some Luftwaffe officers found it genuinely funny. Within 2 years, Göring would stand in front of Germany's own aircraft manufacturers and say the words out loud, that the sight of this aeroplane made him turn, in his phrase, green and yellow with envy. German night fighter crews would coin a word for what it did to them: Moskitopanik. And by several German accounts, shooting one down was eventually credited as 2 victories, because catching one at all was considered that close to impossible. This is the story of the de Havilland Mosquito, the airplane the experts rejected, the enemy mocked, and the war vindicated more completely than any machine in the sky. The story of exactly when the laughing stopped, and why it never started again. To understand why the Mosquito existed at all, you have to understand what everyone in 1938 believed a bomber had to be. The doctrine was settled. A bomber was a big, slow, heavily loaded aircraft, and since it could never outrun enemy fighters, it had to fight them off. That meant gun turrets, in the nose, on top, in the tail. Turrets meant gunners. Gunners meant a bigger fuselage, more weight, more drag, less speed, which made the bomber even easier to intercept, which meant it needed more guns. Every major air force in the world was trapped inside this loop. The British were building it into the Sterling and the Halifax. The Americans were building it into the B-17, an aircraft literally named the Flying Fortress. The logic had hardened into something close to religion. The bomber survives by shooting back. Geoffrey de Havilland thought the logic was backwards. De Havilland was not a military man. He was a designer of fast, light civil aircraft, racing planes, mail planes, airliners. His company had won the 1934 air race from England to Australia with the Comet, a sleek twin-engined machine built largely of wood. And when he looked at the bomber problem in 1938, he ran the arithmetic in the opposite direction. Take a bomber. Now, delete the turrets. Delete the guns, the ammunition, the armor, and the 4 crew members who serve them, along with the oxygen, the heating, and the structure that carries all of it. The weight savings cascade. The aircraft shrinks. Fit 2 of the best engines in Britain, Rolls-Royce Merlins, to an airframe now carrying thousands of pounds less than doctrine demanded, and you get a bomber that doesn't have to fight enemy fighters. Because no enemy fighter can catch it. Speed, de Havilland argued, was not a luxury. Speed was armor. The safest bomber would be the one that was simply never intercepted at all. The Air Ministry's reaction, when de Havilland formally proposed the aircraft in 1938 and again in 1939, was somewhere between polite refusal and open bafflement. An unarmed bomber contradicted everything the RAF had built its plans around. One official response suggested the company stop wasting time and build wings for existing bombers instead. And the second half of the proposal struck the ministry as even stranger than the first. De Havilland wanted to build the aircraft out of wood. Not because wood was better in some abstract sense, because what wood meant in a war economy. Aluminium was about to become the single most contested material on Earth. Every fighter, every heavy bomber, every engine cowling in Britain would be fighting for the same supply. Wood came from a completely separate universe. Timber yards, veneer mills, furniture workshops. A wooden aircraft would not take a single sheet of aluminium away from a Spitfire, and it could be built by an entire skilled workforce, carpenters, joiners, cabinet makers, that the aviation industry had no other way to use. The Air Ministry was not persuaded. What saved the Moskito was one man. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman was the officer responsible for aircraft development and production, and he was that rarest thing in a large bureaucracy, a senior official willing to spend his own reputation on an idea his institution hated. Freeman pushed the project through over sustained internal opposition. In parts of the Air Ministry, the aircraft acquired a nickname before it acquired a serial number. They called it Freeman's Folly. In December 1939, with the war 3 months old, de Havilland got permission to proceed. On March 1st, 1940, the Air Ministry placed an order for 50 aircraft, against specification B1/40, written essentially around a design that already existed. Even then, the program survived on a thread. It was suspended more than once as Britain's crisis deepened in the summer of 1940, rescued each time by Freeman's protection and de Havilland's refusal to stop. The design team did not work at the company's main factory at Hatfield. They worked a few miles away at a moated country house called Salisbury Hall, behind blackout curtains, in secrecy so tight that the mock-up was built in a hangar disguised as a barn. There, through the Battle of Britain, with the Luftwaffe overhead and invasion expected weekly, a small group of engineers, built by hand an aeroplane the official mind had already dismissed. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, serial W4050, painted bright yellow, took off from a grass field with Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's son, at the controls. The flight lasted about half an hour, and it ended every argument except one. Nobody yet knew just how fast this thing really was.
Before we get to what the prototype did in testing, and what it did stunned people who did not stun easily, you need to understand what this airplane actually was. Because made of wood undersells it the way made of metal undersells a Swiss watch. The Moskito's fuselage was a sandwich. 2 skins of Canadian birch plywood, and between them a thick core of Ecuadorian balsa, one of the lightest structural materials in nature. Bonded together, the sandwich behaved like something new, stiff like metal, light like balsa, and smooth in a way riveted aluminium could never be. There were no rivets, no seams catching the airflow. The entire fuselage was formed in 2 halves, like a model kit, over huge concrete and mahogany molds. And the 2-half construction hid a production masterstroke. With the fuselage split open lengthwise, workers could install the hydraulics, the control runs, the wiring, all the fiddly interior systems, while standing comfortably beside an open shell, instead of crawling inside a closed metal tube. Then the halves were glued and screwed together around the finished interior. Assembly time collapsed. The wing was a single continuous piece, tip to tip, built of spruce and plywood, skinned and doped fabric smooth. Aerodynamically, the Moskito was cleaner than almost anything else flying. The material everyone treated as a step backwards had produced a surface quality metal factories could not match.
Now consider who was building it. Furniture manufacturers, cabinet shops, coach builders, piano makers. Companies that had spent decades making wardrobes and church pews were suddenly making fuselage shells and wing ribs, working to aircraft tolerances with skills they already had. Production dispersed across dozens of small workshops that no bombing campaign could meaningfully target, because how do you find, let alone destroy, an aircraft industry that looks like the British furniture trade? When sections were finished, they came together at assembly plants, like parts of a kit. There was one more advantage, and crews would come to love it. Wood could be repaired anywhere. A flak-shredded metal aircraft needed specialist equipment and replacement panels. A damaged Moskito needed a carpenter, glue, and clamps. Squadrons patched battle damage overnight with materials from a joinery shop. None of this would have mattered if the aircraft had flown like furniture. It did not.
In early trials, the prototype reached 392 miles per hour. Read that number against its moment. In early 1941, this made the Moskito faster than the frontline Spitfire. Faster, in fact, than any operational aircraft the Royal Air Force possessed. A bomber, outrunning the best fighters in the sky. Officials who came to watch the demonstrations saw a twin-engined aircraft perform climbing rolls on one engine and stood in silence doing the same mental arithmetic de Havilland had done in 1938, this time with the answer in front of them. The order book changed character almost overnight. 50 aircraft became hundreds, and the requirement itself began to mutate because everyone who saw the aircraft immediately wanted it for a different job. A photo reconnaissance version, because nothing could catch it. A bomber version, because nothing could catch it. And a night fighter version, with cannon in the nose and radar in a solid nose cap, because if nothing could catch the Mosquito could catch everything.
One airframe, 3 completely different weapons. That flexibility, an accident of a fuselage with an empty nose and a huge internal volume for its size, would end up mattering as much as the speed. The first aircraft to go to war were the reconnaissance versions. In September 1941, an unarmed pale blue Moskito flew a photographic sortie over occupied France, was intercepted by Messerschmitt 109s near the coast, and left them behind. It simply opened the throttles and walked away from the best fighters Germany had. The pattern of the next 4 years compressed into one afternoon. German fighter controllers began logging contacts they could not convert into engagements. Radar tracked a fast intruder. Fighters scrambled. The plot on the German map simply pulled away from the interceptors and crossed out to sea. It happened again. Then again. At first, German intelligence assumed the reports were exaggerated, pilots covering their failure with claims of impossible enemy speed. They were not exaggerated. And on the British side, the same performance was about to be pointed at something harder than photography. The bomber Mosquitoes went to number 105 Squadron, and their first operation set the tone. On May 31st, 1942, the morning after the RAF's first 1,000 bomber raid pounded Cologne, Mosquitoes appeared over the burning city in daylight, dropping bombs into the chaos and photographing the damage while the smoke was still rising. The message inside the message: we can come back whenever we like, and you cannot stop us. But the early bomber operations were not a parade. This is the part of the story that gets skipped, and it shouldn't be, because it's where the crews earned everything that came later. The tactic 105 Squadron developed was low-level daylight attack, and low-level meant something almost absurd. Crossing the North Sea at 50 feet to stay under German radar, hedge-hopping across Holland and Germany below rooftop height, lifting a wing to clear church steeples at more than 300 miles per hour. At that altitude, there was no room for error, and no parachute worth wearing. Flak gunners got seconds of tracking time, but a bird strike, a power line, or a moment's inattention was just as lethal. Losses in the first months were real, and there were officers in Bomber Command still unconvinced by Freeman's folly, ready to say so. Then came September 25th, 1942, and a target that announced what this aircraft was actually for. Oslo. The Gestapo headquarters in occupied Norway, a specific building in the middle of a specific city on a day when Vidkun Quisling's collaborationist movement was holding a rally. 4 Mosquitoes flew across the North Sea at wave height, made landfall in Norway, and attacked the building at rooftop level in broad daylight. 1 aircraft was lost to fighters. Several bombs tore through the building without detonating properly. The fusing was not yet equal to the aircraft delivering it. As a demolition job, the raid was imperfect. As a statement, it was perfect.
A precision airstrike on a single address in an occupied capital, delivered from another country at a time chosen for maximum humiliation. Norwegian resistance morale surged, and in Berlin, planners were confronted with a new category of problem. There was now an Allied aircraft that could reach out and touch a building, and the building might be yours. The low-level campaign sharpened through the winter. Mosquitoes hit power stations, rail workshops, U-boat engine plants, targets that mattered, struck with an accuracy the heavy bomber force at night could not approach. In December 1942, they joined the coordinated low-level strike on the Philips Electronics Works at Eindhoven, one of the most important electronics plants in German-controlled Europe, sitting in the middle of a Dutch city where area bombing was unthinkable. The factory was wrecked. The town around it largely spared. Only precision at rooftop height could thread that needle.
Understand what rooftop height actually demanded of the men inside. The Moskito's crew of 2 sat side by side, almost shoulder to shoulder. Pilot on the left, navigator beside him with the maps on his knees. At 350 miles per hour and 50 feet, the navigator was map-reading Europe as it came at him at 150 meters every second. A canal, a windmill, a rail junction, each one a fix that had to be caught, matched, and called in the moment it flashed past, because the next turning point was 90 seconds away, and there was no climbing up to look around. Crews came back with their aircraft draped in evidence of how they'd flown. Telephone wire trailing from tail wheels, leaves packed into radiator intakes, and on at least one documented occasion, pieces of a German chimney. The campaign peaked in ambition on May 27, 1943, when Mosquitoes flew one of the deepest low-level daylight penetrations of the entire war, across the width of Germany to attack the Zeiss optical works at Jena, the plant grinding the lenses for German bomb sights, periscopes and rangefinders. Crews threaded valleys in worsening weather, hit the target through intense light flak, and fought their way home at treetop height. Losses were painful, and the raid marked the end of an era. The elite daylight squadrons, 105 and 139, were being pulled from low-level work for a new assignment, one that would quietly make them the most important bomber crews in Europe. We'll get there. German defenses adapted the only way they could. More light flak around likely targets, standing fighter patrols on the coastal routes. The interception problem, though, refused to be solved. To catch a Mosquito, a Focke-Wulf 190 needed altitude advantage, perfect positioning, and luck. And even then, the closing speeds left an attack window of seconds. German pilots described chases in which they held full throttle in a shallow dive and watched the range increase. By the start of 1943, the wooden bomber had stopped being a curiosity in German assessments and become a nuisance. What it had not yet become was a humiliation. That took one more raid, the one you already know about. The January 30th raid on Berlin was, in tonnage, almost nothing. A handful of aircraft, a few bombs.
Against a city that would eventually absorb tens of thousands of tons, it barely registered as damage. It registered everywhere else. The timing was the weapon. The morning wave from 105 Squadron arrived over Berlin at 11 o'clock, the exact minute Göring's anniversary broadcast was scheduled to begin. The afternoon wave from 139 Squadron arrived at 4, on the hour of Goebbels' speech. One Moskito was lost that afternoon. The other aircraft flew home. And the German propaganda apparatus was left to explain to its own population why the Reichsmarshal's voice had been replaced live on national radio by air raid sirens.
For Göring, this was personal, in a way few events of the air war were. This was the man who had boasted that if enemy bombers ever appeared over the Reich, the public could call him by a Jewish name, a boast the RAF's heavy bombers had already been shredding at night. But night raids could be spun as terror, endured in darkness. This was daylight. 2 men, a wooden airplane, over the capital, on the regime's most sacred anniversary. Twice. On schedule. Later in 1943, addressing German aircraft manufacturers, Göring vented his feelings about the Moskito in words that have been recorded and have followed the aircraft ever since. It made him furious to see it, he said. It turned him green and yellow with envy. The British, he raged, who could afford aluminum better than Germany, had knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there was building, and kept giving it more speed. There is an entire strategic autopsy compressed inside that outburst. And notice what it is not. It is not laughter. 18 months earlier, a wooden, unarmed bomber had been read in Germany as evidence of British desperation. Now, the commander of the Luftwaffe was standing in front of his own industry, holding it up as the thing he could not have.
The regime's information machinery, so fluent at reframing catastrophe, never found a workable story for the Moskito. The night raids by heavy bombers could be narrated as terror from cowards hiding in darkness, a story with a villain and a grievance. But how do you narrate this? Admit the aircraft was formidable, and you admit the Luftwaffe cannot stop a plywood bomber over the capital. Repeat that it was a joke made of wood, and you make the failure to stop it more humiliating, not less. German newsreels and communiques mostly chose a third option. They talked about something else. Meanwhile, the practical costs compounded quietly. Every daylight alarm over Berlin stopped work in factories and offices across the city. Fighter units were held back for capital defense. Flak batteries, gunners, ammunition, radar. A growing slice of German resources stood pointed at the sky, waiting for a handful of 2-man aircraft, and mostly hitting nothing. The Moskito had discovered something modern militaries would spend the rest of the century relearning. A weapon that cannot be reliably stopped extracts its price, whether or not it shows up.
Inside the Luftwaffe's fighter force, the frustration turned physical. Intercepting a high-flying Moskito in 1943 meant a climbing stern chase in which the German fighter's performance decayed with every 1,000 feet, while the targets barely did. Pilots reached firing range rarely and held it for seconds. The pattern from the reconnaissance war of 1941 was now the pattern everywhere, and German fighter pilots, men with victory totals in the dozens, were filing reports about a bomber they could see, track, chase and not catch. Göring was right that he could not have it, and we'll get to exactly why, because Germany did try to copy the Mosquito, directly and by name, and the way that attempt died is one of the most brutal ironies of the entire war. Hold that thread. Because first, you need to see what the Mosquito did next. The Berlin speech raid was theatre. Devastating theatre, but theatre. In 1943, the aircraft stopped performing gestures and started dismantling the German war effort in 4 different ways at once.
Here is the strange thing about the Mosquito's war record. The aircraft's most important contribution was probably its least cinematic. It was a job called pathfinding. Bomber Command's night offensive had a dirty secret, exposed by its own photo analysis. Through 1941, most crews were not putting their bombs within miles of the aiming point. Navigating a heavy bomber across blacked-out Europe by dead reckoning, at night, under fire, scattered bombs across the countryside. The solution was to stop asking every crew to find the target, and instead send specialists ahead to find it and mark it with coloured flares so the main force could bomb the marks. The specialists needed an aircraft fast enough to survive alone, high-flying enough to use a new radio beam guidance system called Oboe, and precise enough to matter. Oboe worked by measuring an aircraft's range from 2 stations in England, and it was accurate to within a few hundred yards over the roar, but only at high altitude, near the radio horizon. The higher the aircraft, the deeper the beams reached into Germany.
One aircraft in the Allied inventory flew high enough, fast enough, and survivably enough to carry Oboe into the Reich. From early 1943, Oboe Mosquitoes of the Pathfinder Force opened raid after raid on the Ruhr, dropping target indicators onto factories through complete overcast, with the main force streaming in behind to bomb the glow. The accuracy of the entire British night offensive stepped upward. The Battle of the Ruhr in 1943 was a different kind of campaign than anything before it. And at the tip of it, guiding hundreds of heavy bombers apiece, were 2 men in a wooden aircraft. Weigh that for a moment. The aircraft rejected because it carried no guns had become the aiming device for the largest bombing force in Europe. Then there was the light night striking force. And this is where the Mosquito's arithmetic turns openly insolent.
Engineers found that with a bulged bomb bay, the Mosquito could carry the 4,000-pound Cookie, the RAF's massive blast bomb, all the way to Berlin. Sit with that comparison, because crews at the time certainly did. An American B-17 flying to Berlin typically carried around 2 tons of bombs, with 10 men aboard, in a formation crawling along at under 200 miles per hour, fighting for its life the entire way. A Mosquito carried the same 2 tons to the same city with 2 men aboard, cruising far faster and far higher, so hard to intercept that its loss rate would end the war as the lowest in Bomber Command. Fewer crew at risk per raid than a single heavy bomber, delivering the same headline load. And they went constantly. Through the last winter of the war, Mosquitoes of the Light Night Striking Force raided Berlin on 36 consecutive nights. Berliners called them by name. The sirens, the crack of the cookies, the impossibility of stopping it, night after night after night. A metronome of 2-man aircraft the Luftwaffe could not answer. German night fighter crews were being asked to intercept a target that cruised roughly as fast as their own maximum speeds, at altitudes where their performance sagged. Most nights, nobody even made contact.
While the bomber versions were doing that, the fighter versions were fighting a completely different war. Actually, two of them. The first was defensive. Radar-equipped Moskito night fighters took over the defense of Britain's night sky. And when the Luftwaffe attempted a renewed bombing campaign against London in early 1944, the so-called Baby Blitz, Moskitos helped bleed it white. Then, in the summer of 1944, came the V-1 flying bombs. Small, fast, pilotless, arriving around the clock. Catching a V-1 required an aircraft fast enough to overhaul a 400-mile-per-hour target and stable enough to shoot at a flying bomb from close range at night. Moskito crews destroyed more than 600 of them. The second fighter war was offensive, and this is where the German word comes from. Moskito intruders began following German night fighters home. They loitered in the dark over Luftwaffe airfields, waiting for the enemy's radar-equipped fighters, the ones butchering British heavy bombers, to return from their patrols. A German crew would survive a night's combat, line up on their own runway, flip on their landing lights, and die in their final 30 seconds of flight, cannon fire arriving out of the blackness behind them. Others crashed attempting frantic evasion at landing speed, with no Moskito nowhere near them. That was the point. The Germans called the phenomenon Moskitopanik, and it was precisely what the name suggests, a fear that reshaped behavior. Night fighter crews rushed approaches, dispersed to distant fields, sat grounded when they were needed overhead. The mere possibility of a Moskito in the landing pattern degraded the German night fighter force on nights when not a single intruder was actually there. By several German accounts, the Luftwaffe took to crediting a Moskito kill as double, an admission written into the scoring system itself of how rarely it happened. And the hunt went deeper than airfields. Some Moskitos carried equipment that homed on the emissions of German airborne radar, meaning a German night fighter crew switching on the very instrument they needed to find British bombers was in the same moment ringing a dinner bell for a Moskito somewhere in the darkness behind them. From late 1943, an entire Royal Air Force formation, 100 Group, existed to wage this shadow war. Moskitos hunting night fighters by their own electronic breath, escorting the bomber stream from inside the darkness, flying spoof raids to drag German defenses hundreds of miles from the real target. German night fighter crews, already outnumbered, now had to treat their own radar as a liability and their own runways as a kill zone. A force that had been butchering British heavy bombers in 1943 spent much of 1944 looking over its shoulder. It is worth pausing on what all this felt like from the ground in Berlin, because the Moskito's psychological war on the German capital rivaled its physical one. A heavy raid was a catastrophe, but it was occasional. The Moskitos were always there. A handful of aircraft, most nights, enough to trigger full alarms across a city of millions. Sirens, cellars, lost sleep, lost production. Again the next night, and the next. Goebbels complained in his own diary about the raids by these fast bombers and the disproportionate disruption they caused. A few dozen men in plywood aircraft were imposing air raid discipline on the capital of the Reich at will,
and everyone in Berlin knew the Luftwaffe could not make it stop.
The Americans noticed. The US 8th Air Force, which possessed the largest bomber fleet on Earth, quietly acquired British-built Mosquitos of its own and flew them on reconnaissance, weather scouting, and special missions ahead of its formations. When the commander of 1,000 flying fortresses wants his most sensitive missions flown by a British wooden aeroplane, the argument about the aeroplane is over.
And then there is the strangest entry in the Moskito's service record, the one that isn't military at all. Throughout the war, unarmed Moskitos wearing civil airline markings flew a scheduled route between Scotland and neutral Sweden, straight across the Luftwaffe patrolled Skagerrak, in what amounted to a commercial airline service through a war zone. Outbound, they carried diplomatic mail. Home, they carried Swedish ball bearings, a precision component Britain's war industry was desperately short of. And, occasionally, a passenger, lying in the converted bomb bay, wearing flying gear and an oxygen mask. In October 1943, one of those bomb bay passengers was the physicist Niels Bohr, one of the most important scientific minds of the century, freshly escaped from occupied Denmark and urgently wanted by the Allied atomic program. Bohr's oxygen arrangements went wrong at altitude, and he lost consciousness over the North Sea. The crew descended and delivered him alive. Which means the aircraft's cargo manifest across the war years reads bombs, cameras, flares, cannon shells, ball bearings, mail. There was, in the end, very little this machine was not asked to carry. Reconnaissance Moskitos, meanwhile, kept photographing whatever Germany least wanted photographed, including the secret weapons site at Peenemünde, where British photo interpreters studying Moskito imagery found the V-2 rocket lying on its trailer before the first one ever flew. Pathfinder, heavy-hitting night bomber, night defender, V-1 killer, airfield assassin, spy. One airframe, made of furniture-grade wood, was now running 6 different campaigns simultaneously, and we still haven't covered the missions it became most famous for.
Before the most famous missions, spend a moment inside the machine, because the men who flew the Mosquito talked about it in a way aircrew rarely talk about bombers. They gave it a pet name almost immediately, the Mossy. Pilots coming to it from heavy bombers described something close to disbelief. A bomber that handled like a fighter, that climbed away on one engine, that answered the controls instead of arguing with them. Pilots coming from single-seat fighters found the one thing their old aircraft could never give them: company. The Mosquito's 2 men sat inches apart, close enough to read each other's faces without the intercom. Crews paired up and stayed paired, sometimes for 100 operations and more, and the bond between a Moskito pilot and his navigator became one of the tightest partnerships in the wartime RAF. 2 men, alone, deep over Germany, each one the other's entire crew. The confidence the aircraft bred showed up in the statistics, and it showed up in behavior. Heavy bomber crews counted down a 30-operation tour, praying the arithmetic missed them. Moskito crews of the Night Striking Force flew to Berlin. Berlin! So routinely that the run acquired the flat, insolent nickname of a commuter service, the Milk Run. Some crews passed 100 sorties, the most dangerous city in Europe reduced to a schedule. Even maintenance had a personality. When a Moskito came home flak damaged, the repair party that turned out included men whose trade certificates said carpenter and joiner. Squadron records note repairs performed with wood, glue, screws and clamps that would have sent a metal aircraft to a depot for weeks. There are accounts of station workshops splicing new sections into damaged airframes the way a boatyard repairs a hull. And on the night that mattered most, June 5th into June 6th, 1944, mosquitoes were threaded through the entire fabric of the invasion of Europe. Night fighters shielding the airborne drops, intruders sitting over Luftwaffe fields to keep the German night force on the ground, bombers striking the roads and rail lines behind the beaches. In the weeks that followed, while thunderbolts owned the Norman daylight, the mosquitoes owned the dark, hunting German transport by moonlight and headlight. The German army in Normandy learned there was no hour of the day when movement was safe. The daylight half of that lesson has its own episode on this channel. This was the other half.
By 1944, the Moskito fighter bomber, the FB Mark VI, with 4 20mm cannon and 4 machine guns in the nose and a bomb load behind them, had made a specialty out of a mission no other aircraft in the world could fly: the precision demolition of a single building at rooftop height in the middle of an occupied city without flattening the neighborhood around it. The most famous of these missions began with a plea from the French resistance. Amiens prison in northern France held more than 700 prisoners, among them resistance members facing execution. The request that reached England was extraordinary: breach the prison walls with bombs so the prisoners could run. Get it slightly wrong in one direction and the walls stand and the executions proceed. Get it slightly wrong in the other direction and the bombs kill the people they came to free. On February 18th, 1944, in weather so foul the mission was nearly scrubbed, mosquitoes went in at 50 feet through driving snow. The lead crews put their bombs against the outer wall and the guardhouse with such precision that the breaches opened exactly where planned. 258 prisoners escaped through the snow. The cost was real, and it was paid at the top. The raid's leader, Group Captain Percy Pickard, one of the most decorated bomber pilots in the RAF, stayed over the target to confirm the breach, was caught by a Focke-Wulf 190, and was killed along with his navigator, Bill Broadley. Around 100 prisoners died in the bombing and the breakout. The raid remains argued over to this day. What has never been argued is what it proved. Air power could now perform surgery.
The Gestapo learned this next, repeatedly, and by street address. On October 31st, 1944, mosquitoes crossed the North Sea at wave height and destroyed the Gestapo headquarters for Jutland, housed in buildings of Aarhus University in Denmark, in a strike so precise and so sudden that the organization's records of the Danish resistance burned before they could be acted on. Prisoners under interrogation inside the building survived. Their files did not. Similar strikes followed against Gestapo buildings elsewhere in occupied Europe, some brilliantly clean, one at Copenhagen in March 1945, marred by tragedy when a crashing aircraft misled following crews and bombs struck a school. The crews carried that. It is part of the record too.
But step back and look at what this target list is. Prisons, records offices, individual headquarters buildings. By the last year of the war, the German security apparatus in occupied Europe had to plan around the possibility that any specific building it occupied could be deleted in daylight on a chosen morning by an aircraft that would arrive below the level of the rooftops with almost no warning. Gestapo officers in Denmark and Norway began scattering their offices, moving files, sleeping away from headquarters. That is not the behavior of men being bombed. That is the behavior of men being hunted. And out over the sea lanes, yet another Moskito variant was doing something so excessive it sounds invented. A version armed with a 57mm anti-tank gun, a 6-pounder artillery piece firing out of the nose, punching through the pressure hulls of surfaced U-boats. Coastal Command strike wings flying from Scotland swept the Norwegian coast with cannon and rocket-armed Moskitos, closing German shipping routes that had been safe for 4 years.
There was, by late 1944, no altitude, no time of day, no category of target, and no corner of the German-controlled map where this aircraft was not operating. So the obvious question, the one Göring had been shouting at his own industry since 1943, becomes unavoidable. Why didn't Germany just build one? They tried. Here is the thread from Act 4, paid off in full.
The German answer to the Moskito could not have been more explicit about what it was. Focke-Wulf's design team, under Kurt Tank himself, produced a fast twin-engined aircraft built substantially of wood. The Luftwaffe designation was TA-154. Its name, officially, was Moskito. The aircraft the Luftwaffe had laughed at in 1941, Germany was now attempting to photocopy, down to the name, in 1943. On paper, the TA-154 was credible. Fast, wooden, twin-engined, intended as a night fighter. The prototype flew and showed promise. And then the program collided with the difference between an aeroplane and an industrial ecosystem.
A wooden high-performance aircraft lives or dies on its adhesive. The de Havilland Mosquito was held together by specialized bonding, a chemistry and a set of production disciplines refined across years of building wooden aircraft, from racing planes to airliners. Germany had exactly one plant producing the special Tego film adhesive the Ta-154 depended on, in the city of Wuppertal. In the summer of 1943, RAF Bomber Command burned the heart out of Wuppertal. Raids opened and marked, as the great raids of that year were, by Pathfinder mosquitoes. The Tego film plant was destroyed. Read that again slowly, because the war contains few ironies this clean. The German copy of the Moskito was crippled by a bombing campaign that mosquitoes were guiding.
Focke-Wulf switched to a substitute adhesive. The adhesive was acidic, and it quietly attacked the wood around every joint it touched. Test aircraft shed structure in flight. Aircraft broke up. Investigators traced the failures back to the glue eating the airframe from the inside. The program staggered on and was cancelled. Only a handful of Ta-154s were ever completed, and the type did nothing of consequence. Germany had copied the shape of the Moskito. It could not copy the furniture trade, the adhesive chemistry, the mould-making, the woodworking workforce, or the 20 years of institutional knowledge underneath the shape. The Moskito looked simple. It was the opposite of simple. It was an entire national capability disguised as a simple airplane, which is exactly what Göring had understood, and exactly why he was green and yellow about it. The conventional attempts fared no better, and one of them deserves its own moment, because it shows the problem was never German engineering. The Heinkel 219 Uhu, the Owl, was arguably the finest piston-engined night fighter of the war. Fast, heavily armed, purpose-built, the first operational German aircraft with ejection seats. On its very first operational sortie, in June 1943, its most famous exponent, Werner Strybe, shot down 5 British heavy bombers in a single night. The aircraft worked, and it was strangled anyway, by production politics inside the Luftwaffe's own ministries, by officials who preferred rival programs, by an industrial system that could no longer afford to bet on a new type. The HE-219 reached the front in numbers too small to change anything. Even where it flew, catching a high, fast Moskito remained a marginal proposition. Standard night fighters, weighed down with radar antennas and heavy armament, were being asked to chase a target cruising near their own maximum speeds. Germany's problem was not that it couldn't design an answer. It's that its system could no longer build its answers, while Britain's furniture trade turned out Moskitos by the hundreds per month.
In the end, only the jet could do it. And even the jet announced itself by failing. On July 25, 1944, over Bavaria, a Messerschmitt 262 made what is generally recorded as the first combat interception attempt by a jet fighter in history. Its target? A lone reconnaissance Moskito. The jet made repeated firing passes. The Moskito, corkscrewing hard, evaded them all and escaped into cloud, landing damaged but whole. The first jet combat in the history of air warfare was an attempt to catch this airplane, and the airplane got away. In the war's final months, the balance did finally tip. Me-262s, including a small specialist night fighter unit defending Berlin under Kurt Welter, whose victory claims ran heavily to Moskitos, could at last run down the wooden bomber. Think about what that sentence contains. The instrument required to reliably intercept a plywood aircraft designed in 1938 was the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet. And it existed in numbers too small, too starved of fuel and pilots, and far too late to matter. The Moskito had held its lead against the entire German aviation industry for effectively the whole war. Strip away the raids and the nicknames and judge the Moskito the way the P-47 or the Red Ball Express deserve to be judged, by the pitiless arithmetic underneath. 7,781 built, in England, in Canada, in Australia, without consuming the aluminium or competing for the factories that Britain's Spitfires and Lancasters demanded. A combat aircraft conjured largely out of a resource stream and a workforce that would otherwise have sat outside the war entirely. Bomber Command's Moskitos flew just under 40,000 sorties and lost around 250 aircraft doing it, a loss rate of roughly 0.6%, the lowest of any aircraft in the command. The heavies flying to the same Germany were losing crews at several times that rate, 7 men at a time. The unarmed bomber, the configuration rejected in 1938 as suicidal, turned out to be the safest bomber of the entire war. Every gun turret in every doctrine manual had been answering the wrong question. De Havilland's arithmetic from 1938 was not a gamble that happened to pay off. It was a theorem, and the war spent 5 years proving it. For a bomber, in that war,
Speed protected crews better than guns ever did.
And the deeper lesson is the one Göring choked on. The Mosquito was not merely a clever design. Germany had clever designs in abundance. It was a clever design matched to its nation's actual resources. Spare wood, spare woodworkers, spare workshop capacity, world-class engines, and one stubborn air marshal willing to be mocked. The Ta-154 failed for the mirror image reason. A design Germany's real industrial base could not actually support. The same verdict again. Wars between industrial nations are won by the side that best converts what it has into what flies.
So run the story back one last time. In 1940, a wooden bomber with no guns was Freeman's Folly in London and a desperation measure in Berlin. By 1943, it was silencing the Reichsmarschall on live radio and marking the targets for the destruction of the Ruhr. By 1944, it was breaching prison walls at 50 feet, hunting U-boats with an artillery piece, and terrorizing the Luftwaffe over its own runways. By 1945, Berliners were hearing it 36 nights in a row. Germany's copy of it was dissolving in its own glue, and the only machine on Earth that could catch it was a jet that had arrived too late. The Luftwaffe's assessment in 1941 was not stupid. Everything they believed about wooden aircraft and unarmed bombers was reasonable. It was simply built on the wrong question. The same wrong question every Air Force was asking. Geoffrey de Havilland asked a different one. What if the bomber never has to fight at all?
The plywood answer to that question outlived the Reich that laughed at it. The prototype W4050, the yellow aeroplane from the barn behind the moated house, still exists. You can stand next to it today at the de Havilland Museum, a few miles from where it was built in secret, while the Battle of Britain burned overhead. It is made of wood and glue. It humiliated an empire. If this story earned its place in your feed, the subscribe button tells the algorithm to send you the next one. And tell me in the comments, which detail lands hardest for you? The radio speech? The glue that ate the German copy? Or the fact that the safest bomber of the war carried no guns at all? I read every one.